At Quite the Thing Media, we aim to bring you the best podcasts produced by independent creators.
This is Zach from the Neatcast and Effin' Cultured. Thanks for joining Podcast Father on his journey, sharing the great things that all sorts of creators are doing. He's the indie podcaster.
You've been searching for a podcast. Want to know about some great artist? You've come to the right place. Indie Podcaster, with your host, the Podcast Father.
Indie Podcaster is the name of this podcast, and I'm your host, Jeff, a.k.a. Podcast Father. Claire Sanama from 48 Hours, producer and the creator and host of the Final Days on Earth podcast, joins me. Going on?
Yeah, how's it going, Jeff?
How is the 48-hour lifestyle going?
Man, it's good. 24 hours a day, 48 hours, and then podcast in between.
Yes. What do they say about the first 48 hours? They're absolutely crucial.
That's right. Yeah. If you can, when a crime's been committed, when a person goes missing, the first 48 hours are the most important in solving that case. If you can solve it in those 48 hours, then, it's more than likely you can tie it off. But if it gets past that, it gets harder and harder to actually find out what happened.
Absolutely. And we will talk about your podcast for a second. Final Days on Earth, Mysterious Death of Damien Hurd. It is a story that everybody must hear.
Well, thanks. I appreciate you saying that. I certainly feel the same way. I did 12 episodes on Damien's life and death and his mysterious disappearance from a party on the last night of his life.
Everybody make sure you check that out. Today, we're going to talk about Stephanie Fuccio. She runs GeoPats Podcast Network, Pod Rev Day. She's a podcast editor. She does a lot.
She is all over the place.
Do you follow the Pod Rev Day account at all?
I do. Yeah. I love that she's the brains behind that. It stands for Podcast Review Day. You gotta, those kids and their abbreviations, right? You gotta make it sound shorter. It's
gotta be a hashtag.
Yeah, totally. Hashtag PodRev Day. So 8th of every month. I love the consistency. Podcast holiday, as they say. It's a great idea, get out there, give people some reviews. I think that, every podcaster loves to get a positive review. And this is a way to put some good vibes out in the podcast universe.
During this interview, I think everybody will realize how dedicated she is to kind of being really involved in helping the independent podcast community. She does a lot of different things.
Yeah, it's impressive. I don't know how she keeps it all straight, but more power to her.
I can't even remember to put on socks in the morning. But I guess we can just go ahead and jump into this interview. I hope you enjoy it, but let me take care of a little business real quick. Myself and this podcast are proud members of Quite the Thing Media. Make sure you're checking out Quite the Thing Media. Go to quitethethingmedia.com. If you want to go to my personal site, it's actually at Quite the Thing Media. quitethingmedia.com/podcastfather. There you can request to be on this podcast as a guest. Also, a review from me on site. Make sure you're checking out all the great original podcasts on site and the independent creators on site. quitethingmedia.com. Couldn't do this podcast without the hosting platform, Captivate FM. Captivate FM is great, guys. I can't tell you how great it is. I could talk about it all day, but I will tell you one thing. For me, as a new podcaster, it's amazing. There's all sorts of tools, growth labs, etc. The team is so hands-on at Captivate FM. They will help you through your journey. If you're a podcaster or content creator, you want to distribute your stuff, go to CaptivateFM.com. They'll go ahead and give you 7 free days off the bat. But I'll tell you what, if you go to my Quite the Thing Media page, quitethingmedia.com/podcastfather, there at the bottom, you'll find an affiliate link. You can get 30 days of Captivate FM free. Why wouldn't you check it out? Captivate FM. This podcast is sponsored by Good Pods, my great friends at Good Pods. This is an amazing app, guys. You get on there, you see what podcasts your friends and influencers are listening to. Download the Good Pods app. All the music on this podcast is from the artist Young Carts. Young Carts, great independent artist. You got to check out all the work. Go to the site, youngcartsbeats.com. If you want to contact me, you can find me on Twitter at podcast_father, or the podcast actually has an account too at indie_podcaster, or good old fashioned email, always great too, thepodcastfather@gmail.com. You want to support this podcast? One great way you can do for me is you can go onto your favorite podcast listening platform, may that be an Apple or Good Pods, and give me a rating. Throw me a 5-star. Type some nice things to me. If you don't even want to type, don't worry about it. Just throw me some stars. Any feedback is appreciated. I really do appreciate it. If you want to get real crazy and support me, you can always buy me a coffee. Check it out on my Quite the Thing media page. That's enough for the business. Let's get to the view. Steph, I'm super excited. I can call you Steph, right? Or do you prefer Stephanie? Oh, okay. I'm super excited for you to join me today. You are involved in so many different awesome things from a creative standpoint and a podcasting standpoint. So I'll give you a minute to introduce yourself and all the things you're involved in.
Oh gosh, that's a lot. Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I have a lot of spokes in my podcasting wheel is like, for some reason, the analogy that I keep using. So that includes running the Geopets Podcast Network, which has a bunch of different shows, some going, some, I wouldn't say pod-faded, I'd say less frequent. I also run a Podcast Review Day, which is a podcast sharing or podcast matchmaking event. I don't know. We're still thinking about what we are, but it's been going on for a year and a half over on Twitter on the 8th of every month, where we share podcasts that we like via reviews. I also am a podcast editor, and I sometimes do workshops or other community events. And I don't know, I like experimenting in the space and seeing what's needed and what I can talk about.
Yeah, that's a good summary. And it was fast, but there sure is a lot to it, honestly. So how did you get started in, and how long have you been involved in, let's just say, podcasting, audio, or even just from a creative standpoint?
Well, I've been a podcast listener for pretty much the whole time it's been a thing, but it wasn't until about 4 years ago that I had that kind of gap in my life where I was like, I need a project, I need to do something, I feel like an expressive need coming on. And a friend of mine who I always, like, we'd get on the phone and we'd talk, a friend of mine back in the US, and we'd talk for a couple of hours each time. And inevitably about an hour of that was about different podcasts that we were listening to. And at one point she just said to me, why don't you have one? Something that most podcasters have people, asking them. And I said, I really don't have an answer for that. And sure enough, after that, I was like, maybe I should take a look at this. Like, is this something I can do? Because at that point, I thought it was something that only networks did. You had to have special equipment, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But you didn't. So I experimented and thought I was going to do like a one-off few episodes thing and just kind of get the ideas out there. And it just kept snowballing.
Well, the concept's been around for a long time, right? Because I know when I was younger, I did a lot of stuff with the internet before it was even called podcasting, right? Probably sound like a broken record repeating myself, but it was more like internet radio sort of thing. So the concept's been around forever, but I'm in the same boat as you. I probably didn't I had been listening to it for a while, but it felt like a long time before I actually heard the term podcasting and looked into it.
For sure. And then as soon as I looked into it, I realized how accessible it actually was. And this is 2017, well after it was already an affordable thing you could do just on the side. But I just had never thought about that. The podcasts I was listening to were more of the bigger ones. I didn't realize there was the entire giant sphere of independent podcasts. And I was like, wow. So then my listening expanded as my podcasting expanded.
Yeah, well, it's also really easy now, right? The more we get advanced with social media or even just the internet. I mean, before you had to really search to find things. Like I know when I did stuff on the internet, you had to somehow know about that site. Mm-hmm. And now they've created all these different distribution hosting platforms that just distribute it on their own. So it's awesome. So talk to us about your first couple of recordings. Like, what were they about? And what were you doing? Were you just talking to your friend or just you talking to yourself? Or
oh, no, I was talking to myself for a while. Oh, gosh, because it was, I'm trying to remember the first few podcasts, because I started YouTube and the podcast at the same time. And I would just moved back to China. I've lived overseas for a long time, but I was in and out of different countries. And I had gotten to China for the second or third time, depending on what you define as China. But anyway, and I was like, okay, well, there's a lot of visualness to what I want to do. So I'm going to do both the podcast and the YouTube channel. And I'm going to see which one is, which one works out better, whether it be my enjoyment factor or people actually wanting to like consume it or what have you. So I was doing stuff related to language. Up to that point, I was teaching language overseas, teaching English overseas for a long time. It never even dawned on me to study a language and kind of document it. But I found all of these YouTubers that were talking about their language learning journey. And I thought, oh, I want to do that. I want to learn Chinese while documenting it and while showing people where I was living and showing them the actual Chinese script. And so I started to do like walkabout videos on YouTube. And then I do kind of my kind of study recaps, which probably sounds really, really boring, but in podcast form. So I kind of did both of those at the same time. And then I realized that there was an expat component to what I was saying. So I started a second podcast about the expat stuff. So I had the language one, then the expat one. And then they just kind of grew into different ones. Yeah.
It kind of sounds like you started it, like you were doing teaching, you kind of had that outlet. It sounds like you almost started it just because you had that creative, like, I don't want to say desire, but you kind of had that creative bug, like to do something. And how long have you been away from the United States? Like when did you start? When did you guys leave and start living everywhere that you've lived?
Yeah, well, I started out solo back in 2003, but but then I met my husband overseas because Vietnam is a very logical place for two Americans to meet and get married. Right?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. Especially Northern Vietnam. Like, that's interesting.
I have twice myself. So yeah, no, I'm just kidding.
So, so the majority of the time has been overseas, but we've come back for different things, usually grad school and different stuff like that. And then trying to move back and realizing we weren't quite done yet. So we went back. So there's little blips where we were in the US, but the majority of the past, 17 years has been in different countries.
Podcasting or just the audio side of it kind of help you being over there, like define something as a hobby almost? If that makes sense, like a creative hobby, kind of fill the void.
Yeah, it makes sense. The thing is, podcasting wasn't the first thing I'd done online. Like way back in the day when blogs were, super popular, I was blogging about my experiences, and I've always like been playful with different things online. So this is like just a different thing, like to do.
It worked its way up to it. It sounds like so. You started out blogging, and then as time goes by and technology goes by, you learn all these different things.
Yeah. It's a lot more. It probably stuck more than any other experiment I did online. And it definitely has developed into a much bigger community than I ever had in any of my other creative online endeavors. Like it's definitely like the podcasting community, and you know this, is just so friendly and cohesive and just lovely.
Yeah, I'm pretty new to it, as you know, but I definitely have experienced that. But it also is almost a lot of clicks or clicky in a way too. You have like a little bit of both. It's a lovely, great, supportive place, but then you do have a lot of like clicks. It reminds me of like middle school or something. Sometimes it's kind of silly. It's kind of silly, honestly.
That's true. But for me, a big creative component that I did before all of this was writing. And to me, that community was much clickier and much more, I don't want to say toxic, but I'd say less supportive than podcasting. So in comparison, this is night and day for me.
Talk to us about the network and how you started that and like what your vision was when you started that and kind of where you're at today with it.
Again, I started it as one podcast, and then as ideas came up, I would start new podcasts. And so they all have a common theme of people that are impacted by different cultures.
Yeah.
So not just the one that they're in, but the ones that are around them, the ones that they've visited, like they kind of collect cultures as they go throughout their lives. And so that's what the geopats thing is. It's kind of a retake on expats, but you don't have to live outside of your home country to be a geopat in my definition of the word that I kind of created, but not necessarily, because it is an engineering term, which I didn't know at first. But so the network just kind of grew, and some of the shows I found like a natural conclusion to. Like I go in with sort of a research question, something I wanted to learn, and I interviewed people until I just felt like we had kind of figured it out. And so those are sitting over on the network, but they're not necessarily updated very often. And then there's a bunch of them that are updated sometimes when that right person comes along, and some of them are updated very often. So it's a network because it's got that cohesiveness, but it isn't necessarily, it's definitely not multiple people because I'm the only host and producer and editor and stuff.
It's just kind of crazy. Like, how do you stop yourself from going like 1,000 different ways at once? I feel like if I was doing that, I would just be like bouncing off the walls everywhere.
Paper is how I do it.
A lot of notes, a lot of
notes, a lot of reminders to stay on track and do, lots of plans. But I do tend to go off on tangents too, though. But I try to stay focused, because ultimately there's a few main goals, and then there's a lot of projects that fall under that.
Tell us about, I just say Pod Rev Day, I guess the short version, but tell us about how that came about, because that's an interesting thing that I hadn't heard of until I was on Twitter. I hadn't heard of it until then. How long? You said a year and a half doing that. How did that come about? You just said, hey, I want to start a community of people supporting and reviewing each other. Like, what was going on?
Heck no. I had just finished National Podcast Posting Month, because everything has to be a super long thing that's reduced to a nickname. So now Pod Pomo. And I was interviewing the founder of that, Jennifer Navarrete, who was amazing. And I found myself, as I was editing that episode with her, I found myself complaining. I was listening to myself complaining about not getting enough reviews. And as the editor listening into the conversation, I was like, oh, I don't review the podcast I listen to. And I felt really guilty. So of course I did what every editor would do. I took out that part from the interview and I made a vow to myself to spend that next month, because Now Pod Pomo was November. And December, I said, I'm going to do my own mini challenge, my own review challenge. So I put on Twitter, hey, this month I'm going to do one podcast review every day of the month. And I was just going to do it myself, and just to kind of stop being a hypocrite. I'm like, if I want reviews, I should give reviews, not to get them, but just like, this is like, I felt like I wasn't even doing what I think good listeners should do. So I was like, I'm going to do this. And people started to say, can I join you? And I just made up a hashtag. It was not Pod Rev Day, but Pod Rev Month, because I was doing it for that 30 days. And it was Pod Rev Mo. And people started to ask if they could join. And I'm like, oh, okay, it's a hashtag. Sure. Of course you can. That'd be cool. And so a bunch of people just started to do reviews as often as they could during that month. And I realized, like, the things that they were saying as they were participating was like, oh, I'm so glad that there's a space for this. I'm so glad there's a challenge for this. I'm so glad you reminded me. And I'm like, I just was writing reviews. Okay.
Yeah.
So that, 30 days was too much.
Well, yeah, that's a substantial amount of days. I can't even.
Yeah. And I'm not a short writer. Like I overwrite and I get emotionally invested in what I'm doing. So 30 reviews in 30 days, I was kind of emotionally spent at that point. So
where were you reviewing them at?
Oh gosh, where was it? I think I was using Podchaser back then. I'd have to go back and check, but I'm pretty sure I was, because I'm not an Apple person. So it definitely wasn't there. It was either Podchaser or it was just doing it in the tweet itself. That's a really good question. Was Podchaser around back then? I don't know. One of those two places. So then I didn't want to do it another 30 days, but I wanted to keep the momentum going. And so I just said, let's do one day a month. Every week is too much. Every month is too much. Once a year is too little. So I just kind of said, okay, let's change it to Pod Rev Day and see if anybody keeps going with it. And it began.
So what was big about the 8th? Is there a reason?
Thank you. In a year and a half, you're only the second person to ask me that. Yeah, there is a massive reason. I had just left, or actually it started just before I left China. No, it started 2019. It started while I was living in China, and 8 is a lucky number there. And if you turn 8 sideways, it looks like infinity. And I wanted it to be like infinite podcasting listening love, which is so corny, but it's true. And there was another reason. There were a couple of different symbolic things like that. So, and my favorite number is 13, so that wouldn't have worked because that's superstitious in too many places. So I figured it's good as any other day. So, yeah.
Now, I finally know that. I've been wondering that. I'm like, why the 8th of the month? Because it was cool to you. That's simple, right?
Yeah.
It meant something
and the place
to you.
I was in, it was a not superstitious, a lucky number. It was a lucky number. So, yeah.
What would you say the growth as far as engagement has been on that over the last year and a half?
It depends on which data you look at. I do actually track the data on Twitter, and I play with it and stuff. And it's been going up and down depending on the month. But the past few months, it's been mostly going up, which is really exciting. So the downs aren't so down anymore. And what's interesting that I didn't expect is, one, it's mostly podcasters who love listening to podcasts. And two, is that people are doing multiple. Like in my vision, I was like, just review one that month, just review one podcast. There's a number of people who review multiple podcasts every month and actually like make notes throughout the month to get ready. And then they do like 10 or 20 different reviews in that one day.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I do several just throughout the month. I didn't even know about PodRev Day until, I don't know, probably a month ago when we found each other on Twitter. But I didn't know and I still didn't know what it meant for a while. I'm like, what the hell is PodRev? I thought about it. I was like, oh, okay. But no, it's cool. And so what would you say like your, ultimate purpose of it is? If you had to define it in short terms, like what is the whole point? I know it's a support thing, but what does it mean to you?
Yeah. That, funny enough, that has only become abundantly clear this week. Because at first I was like, I just want to, inspire people to write reviews, to tell the podcasters that they like their projects, But then I realized recently, because I'm starting to do different things with the community, and I realized I'm starting to play matchmaker a little bit. I go into different areas where people are looking for podcasts, and I'll start to recommend podcasts of people in our community that often participate in the event. And I'm like, oh, I didn't even get that was kind of the overarching momentum of the event, but it really is kind of a matchmaking place. Like you can participate and write the reviews, but it's also a place that people can go on the PodRev Day feed and actually look for reviews too, so they can find what they're looking for. So it's kind of got multiple layers to it. So I don't know. I'm even almost tempted, because we have a podcast and a newsletter now. I'm almost tempted to rename the podcast Matchmaker, because I'm so like light bulb moment from this.
Just this week. It's crazy.
Just this week, a year and a half in. Yeah. Because again, for a while, I didn't view it as something I intentionally started or something that I, decided to make. It just kind of happened. And I was like, okay, well, if people are participating, it's a hashtag. All I have to do is say, hey, everybody, it's PodRev Day. And so, yeah, it was not intentional for a very long time.
It just sounds like it's something that's kind of growing legs and a little bit of momentum. I do want to take another second here to talk about the sponsor of this podcast, Good Pods. Like I mentioned earlier in the intro, you can see what podcasts your friends and influencers are listening to. This app is great, and the creators and team Good Pods are very serious about making you the greatest listening experience for podcasts. Not only just the quality of the audio listening piece, but also the social aspect. This is a really awesome app. I can't suggest it enough. I'm very involved in there. They're very dedicated to podcasters, independent podcasters, and listeners. I have a couple groups on there you should go check out. The Indie Podcasters group, highlight indie podcasters, obviously. I've also recently created a true crime group. I'm a big true crime fan. You should join both of those groups. And every week, we do pick podcasts out of the Indie Podcasters group to highlight in the recommended section. But once again, I'll say it again, the Good Pods team is a great team of people. I can personally vouch for them, but they're also dedicated to making this app as good as possible. You can talk to them on social media directly. They will respond. They take all recommendations very serious. There's a great team at Good Pods. Make sure you download the Good Pods app and listen to your podcast there. Let's get back to the interview. Newsletter. What's this? I'm not familiar with. I apologize. I'm very new to the scene. You know that. Tell us about the newsletter, so I can others and I can check it out.
Yeah, it's still finding its feet. The newsletter and the podcast are only a couple months old, so they're wonky. I think the podcast has found its feet because now I'm interviewing one of the reviewers, and we're doing a themed podcast list. We talk about one of the podcasts in 8 minutes, and then they have a list, so it's a total of 8. So I'm trying to go with the whole 8 theme. So we talk about the event on the 8th of the month. I interview them about one podcast And then they've got a list of 8 in the show notes. And we make that into a Podchaser list and we share that with folks that are looking for that kind of theme podcast. So the podcast, I feel like, has its thing. The newsletter is still struggling. Like, I'm trying to figure out the most useful information for the community because I don't want it to just be a newsletter to collect email addresses. That's never been my goal. It's like, what do they need? What can I give them that I have access to within this community? So right now it's a mix of podcasting resources because, like I said, most of them are podcasters, different listening lists, engagement moments from the event itself, to just in case people missed it. So I've just kind of screenshot those over and just kind of have the lovely feeling moments of, oh, this happened with us. We did this. Yeah. So it's kind of a mix of those things. But I don't feel like the newsletter is quite there yet, but I still think it's useful to some degree.
So you still see growth in it. You're not, I mean, you're going to build upon it.
Yeah. Oh, I'm not done with it. Yeah. I definitely want it to be more than it is, but I don't know exactly what that is yet.
I hear you, because I thought about that too with the newsletter, but I was like, so what? Because I didn't even intend on starting a podcast at first, but I was like, so what is the best way for me to kind of highlight and promote what these people are doing? And of course, like, newsletter always crosses your mind, but then you're like, then I start worrying, does that fit into like where things are going right now, what people are consuming? And then how much time would I have to put into it, which is always a super huge challenge.
Although I tell you this, I wish I had started a newsletter 4 years ago, because with all the incarnations of my projects, I wish I had kept people, I wish I had that one central place to keep people, informed on what was happening. Like, starting it now, I feel like I've not lost, but I feel like I've lost. I keep saying lost. I feel like I could have kept people that started with me much more informed for much longer.
Yeah. And like retain that relationship. Yeah. Because I think that's the best part about a newsletter. It is more than just having like an email listing, but
exactly.
You get to maintain that relationship, because you're right, that can get lost over time. That's a really good point.
Yeah. And I subscribed to some podcasts, but then some of them I subscribe via email only because I want to, or newsletter only, because I want to see the show notes first. And I definitely want to know as soon as it comes out. And I want to see the other things that they get up into, not just the podcast. So I just think it's so clever. I really wish I had started sooner.
It's crazy how things catch on, because I know that when I first got on Twitter with mid-April or something, I come across a lot of all these independent indie podcasts. And I just started, I'm not saying I created the hashtag, do not quote me on that, but I did not see it used very much. So I went up and beyond to annoyingly use it as much as possible, may I add. And now it's like a full-time job for me to retweet
which
hashtag of indie podcast. Like it's like I'm seeing it. Yeah, I've just been retweeting everybody using it. And at first it was like easy because people used it, but it wasn't like much.
Yeah.
And now it's like I've been connected with a lot of smaller podcasts, and they catch on to it. And then you just start seeing, indie podcasts, which is a really cool feeling to like see this community. I'm not saying grow, but it has, I think, and then support each other more. You know what I mean? I don't know if you've seen that too lately. Seems like there's some momentum.
And I figured that I had just missed it before, because I'm not terribly good at keeping track of things. I'll experiment and then I'll kind of move on. So I just figured that it had not been on my radar. I didn't realize it was a fairly recent. Nobody had that going. Really?
I mean, I would see it sometimes, but I really I was like, I'm going to push it to the moon and just as a theme,
Good. Yeah. That's really cool. Yeah. There's a whole bunch of them, right? I have started to make a list now, and I've got, do I have it on me? I do. And this is what I said, paper keeps me on track, because if it's digital, I will lose it. I'm just going to embrace my age. I'm just admitting it. But I've got a whole bunch of hashtags now that people are using. And it's funny because Indie Podcast is one of them. Podlift, which is today's a Tuesday. So Podlift is another one. And there's going to be all kinds of paper noises in here. Do you edit your podcast, or do you have an editor?
I do not have an editor.
Okay. Sorry about that. You're going to have some weird noises in here.
No, I think it gives it, like you literally said, you're going through paper. I think it's awesome. We can literally hear you going through paper. So Podlift, I've definitely heard of that.
It's in my other pile in the other room. This is so sad. I have the people community, like the group community list, but I don't have the hashtag list here. Oh, I have a couple. Podern Family, Indie Podcast. Yeah, but mostly I just have the groups list here. My lists are in multiple places.
You just take notes. That's interesting. Like, so you can go back and check it out, or like, I mean, why exactly would you write down the hashtag?
Because if it's digital, I will lose it. I do use Notion. I use Google Drive like crazy. But for things that I use every day, if I make it into a pretty spreadsheet, I'll forget I have it. And so with the paper, I literally just sit down with my coffee in the morning and take my phone out, and I'm like doing specific things with the stuff in the lists on the paper.
Well, what I mean, are you like looking that up? I mean, you're writing it down for a reason, obviously, so you don't lose it. But I mean, why are you saving it? Are you going back and are you looking up that hashtag, or like what's your reasoning on that in the group?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm compiling lots of lists. I've got for the podcast, for the PodRev Day newsletter, I've got a list of listening communities already. And now I'm doing a list of the hashtags of people that different communities and hashtags and things where people like recommend podcasts. And then
gotcha.
So I'm creating different kind of resource lists that I'm going to have somewhere very organized online at some point.
I'm not going to lie. I wasn't aware that I knew there was a lot of podcasts, especially coming out of the pandemic, COVID, all the stay-at-home orders and all that. But I'm still wrapping my head around the number of podcasters.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I did not realize it. So my mind has been blown away the last couple months.
Oh, yeah. And they just had an article yesterday, Podcast Index, not just in Apple Podcasts, but Podcast Index is getting a lot of podcasts in the index, more than just folks in Apple. And they're almost at 4 million.
Wow.
Podcasts. Yeah. That's a lot.
It is.
Yeah. So it's amazing. But there's never enough. It's like, I'm a huge book person. So for me, I think I would never say there's too many books. So I welcome new podcasts because you never know what kind of interesting stories will come out of that. So
are there, like, what are a few of the I'm going to say mainstream podcasts that you listen to? Now, what are like a few example of indie podcasts that you've come across lately that you were like, oh, these are pretty dang good?
Oh, yeah. It's going to seem very self-promoting because what I do is when I find them, I interview them. So it's going to seem like, check out my interview with them. But I just talked to Casper from Jar of Rebuke, last week. And I am a very late person to audio dramas. But between that one, Girl in Space, and Seen But Not Heard. Seen But Not Heard. Those are the three that have finally broken the seal for me as far as audio dramas go. So I now have a much more open mind for audio dramas. And I'm checking out a bunch more. So there's that one. I always love the guys on the Petri Dish. That's like a science comedy, which I didn't even realize could be a thing until I heard theirs. I have so many. Honestly, I'm just, let me see. Oh, is this explicit or non-explicit?
Oh, go for it. Let it fly.
Okay. There's a short affirmation podcast I love called Real Ass Affirmations. I never remember her full name because she's got a super long name, but if you look up Real Ass Affirmations, you'll see it. It's just like 5-minute bits of really punchy, but really clear, like beautiful advice. A Life in Ruins is an archaeological podcast. I mean, there's so many. Many. Yeah.
How many hours a week do you listen to podcasts?
I refuse to track that.
At least you're honest about it.
No, I would be thoroughly embarrassed if I did. But then before podcasts, I was listening to the radio. I was reading. I've always consumed a lot of stuff. It's just what medium it comes in.
Yeah, I think that was like the cool thing about interviewing you today, because obviously you have like a lot going on within the podcast community, but you're also like a super mega fan, right? I mean,
avid listener. Yeah, I'm thoroughly addicted.
You talked about radio, and that's like, I've been involved in radio quite a bit in the past, especially several years ago. Podcasting does seem like the next thing as radio declines mostly. Still, I guess has its specialty people and characters, but podcasting or audio in this form does seem to be and will continue to be the thing.
I don't think a medium has to necessarily, if I can do the song version, video killed the radio star, I don't think that it has to get rid of the old one.
No.
I still, when I move to a new city, a new country, I still do check out local radio. Sometimes it's for language stuff because I think it's really nice to hear the local language, not just the super enunciated part the way you're supposed to say stuff. But a lot of the times it's got a different, when it is real local radio, I think it has a special flavor to it that is different. But I do agree that radio and podcasts have a different feel to them. Podcasts feel more personal, feel more interest and passion driven than radio does. So I think they seem like they're a similar medium, but I feel like they're very different.
Yeah. And I think obviously podcasts are convenient, right? I mean, you can just take them with you and together. And that's probably why the popularity just continues to increase.
Yeah.
So you also do a lot of editing. I know that you're like, hey, let me edit your is this something that obviously you have experience in it or you wouldn't be like trying to sell it, but is this something new as far as like trying to take it to that next level of, I don't want to say professionally doing it or selling your services to do it? Is this new as far as you doing that?
I've been doing it for 4 years, but I started to do it for other people last year during the pandemic.
That was okay. So last year for other people. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And it's actually before then, it was one of the things that I said I would outsource I used to say it was the first thing I would outsource if my podcast ever monetized, but doing it for other people, I actually started to like it because I didn't have to hear my own mistakes. And there's something really beautiful about that. Editing other people's voices is so much nicer. And then I started to play with the actual DAWs more and play with the effects and have more fun with it. And so I started to get into it a lot more, much to the confusion of the people around me that knew that I used to hate it. And they're like, wait, are you doing this because you're job hunting? Or are you like, what just happened? And I'm like, I don't know. I just like it now. It just like flipped like a switch.
Yeah, it's definitely not my favorite thing. And I haven't done it for a while. So just now getting started on it again and definitely dreading it. But it's important. I feel like it's part of the process, especially when you're starting out. And that's kind of like the whole theme of my podcast. A lot of it is my journey, me starting out as an indie podcaster. And then other creators I'm meeting along the way. But you think it's learning the whole process is important? Because I think it kind of is, as far as like at least learning it, knowing how to do it, the basis of editing.
It depends on your purpose. I mean, if it's business podcasts are super popular right now. So if we're talking about someone who's using, even on the indie side, using it to support their personal business or their independent, what's it called? Small business.
Yeah.
You would want to put your energy into your business, not into your editing process.
True.
Right. So, I mean, and as far as that's concerned, and that's the majority of where my clients are now it's people that really want to just stay in their business and have the podcast. Like they love the conversations they're having with people that they're recording, but they don't want to get in the nitty gritty of the marketing and the podcast editing. They're like, I don't need to learn this. I just want it to be essentially their new business card. Because that's what podcasts are turned into in a lot of ways. And so for them, no, absolutely not. But for independent podcasters, if you have a full-time job and you're podcasting on the side and you can afford it, outsource it. Like unless you want to unless you like it and you're eventually going to like really get into the nitty gritty of the sound parts, or you want to do it as a side gig in the future, like if that's the case, then go nuts. But if you don't like it, have somebody else do it. Never clean my own teeth. I go to a dentist.
That's why I was giving you a minute to express your opinions there. No, it's got to be hard editing somebody else's because like, it's like a whole different creative world trying to vision what somebody else is like. What do they picture? Do you have to like have a lot of drafts and like clear line communication with the people?
Nah. Well, I mean, so far I've been really, really lucky. I mean, you do an onboarding of sorts where you talk about different things they want in and not in them. The first people that approached me were doing like interview podcasts like I do. So I knew what to ask them because I'd been doing it myself for 3 years. So that wasn't that bad. But the first time through, there are a lot more questions. And then after that, you pretty much know what they want. And the rest of it, you're just kind of hoping they like the result. And you just go with what you think is best. But I haven't had any clients yet who really want drastic editing done. Generally speaking, they're conversations, so they don't generally move around giant parts of the episode. Even when I recommend that it might be good to do so, most people don't want to do that.
I interviewed Neon Shadows, an audio drama podcaster the other day, and I made sure to like do my research and listen to several episodes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just crazy the amount of editing you'd have to do for a drama. Is that something that you're willing to like dive that deep into, or are you just sticking to the basics? Because I listened to it, I'm like, this is crazy. All the background noise.
Yeah.
I mean, it is truly, I can't even imagine.
It's amazing. And the people that I know that do audio dramas really well on the production side, the post-production side, on the sound side, are people that came over from either radio or they were trained, they went to like very specific sound, training classes, that kind of thing, degrees, that kind of thing. And that makes a lot of sense. I wouldn't say never, but I would say for me, it's not really where, like I said, I'm just now 4 years into editing, listening to audio dramas. So I can't really envision myself doing that. I am attracted mostly to voices and to conversations and to that thing that happens when people are talking to each other, that kind of spark, that connection. That's where the magic is for me. So I think I'll stay in the interview land for a while.
What do you think is important for, if you had to give advice to somebody that was like wanting to start out on something like a podcast or anything creative, really, what advice would you give them? Because, and this is a question I make sure I ask everybody that I've interviewed, because it's important, I feel like, because everybody has a different experience from it. And you've talked about yours today. What advice would you give people starting out? Because they're going to have their ups and downs.
Mm-hmm. Be a listener.
Be a consumer of the product before you start creating. Yeah.
Like I said, I'm a big book person, and people that read a lot tend to have this desire to write. I know you might have an idea for a podcast, but when you consume other ones, you can kind of, in a lot of ways, it'll inform is way too formal of a way to say it, but it'll kind of give you an idea of what you like. Like if you hear something, you can be like, I want to do an intro similar to that. Oh, I like how they did that segue. Oh, I think I'd never want to do that thing that they just did. It was fine for them, but that's not really what I want to do. Or, it'll kind of keep you creatively active, and it will help you build a podcasting community, which inevitably most people need, because there's a lot to learn with doing this.
What about when they come through times that are hard and challenging? Because you've talked about how you shifted gears and done a whole bunch of different things. So what would you say to people that are having issues getting something off the ground or getting people to listen to it? Or because you don't want to lose hope, but you have to learn from your mistakes too.
Absolutely. Take a break. Schedule in breaks. One of the things I tell people when they're in their first few months of podcasting is don't just say, I'm going to do weekly forever. Weekly's really hard the first year. So if nothing else, don't do weekly the first year, but especially plan your breaks. Like before COVID hit, I had an actual schedule where I was on 3 months and off for a month, and on 3 months and off for a month. And that worked for me. Like I knew that break was coming. If there was any things that kind of slipped through, then I knew that was time I could catch up and plan ahead and that kind of thing. And it was kind of nice. I love doing it, but you need breaks. You need to refresh, rethink, become just a listener for a while to kind of get the creative juices going, and just to do other things. You need other things to feed into your creative life too. You can't burn out, because it'll come across. Your voice does not hide anything.
I agree. And I think that's why you see a lot of podcasts that get into like maybe half a year's worth of content or even a couple months worth. Then you start to see that slow and decline, because the commitment is hard to imagine until you get into it.
Yeah. It's because it looks so easy. You just use your phone, or you grab a cheap mic and you record, and then you upload it and you're done. And then you start to learn everything else you can or should do. And then suddenly hours of your day are gone. Often. And promoting and then talking to people about different other things you can do, and then all the communities, and then more tech. And yeah, it can be a lot. And you need breaks so you can have the balance. It's hard.
I'm super glad that you took a little time out of your day and joined me on this interview. I want to give you a minute to tell people where to go find your stuff, because there'll be new listeners, obviously. And I want to make sure they know where to find all the different things that you're involved in. I'll give you a minute to tell us about it.
Sure. My website is the jumping off point for everything. And I have to spell it because my name is not super common in the US. It's STEP. Well, it's super common in Southern Italy, but I don't think you have many listeners there.
We'll get into the show notes too. Don't worry.
Yeah. So it's STEPHFUCCIO.com. But that Steph Fuccio is also my handle on every social media. I want to say I'm off of TikTok again, so not there. But most social media is Steph Fuccio.
So check out all the different things you have going on, from the network piece, from all the different pod review stuff that you do. And then also you're really starting to push this editing. So,
I'm growing my business.
Yeah, your business savvy side. Yeah. So yeah, thanks again for taking your time out today to do this interview. I appreciate it.
Thank you. This is fun. I appreciate it.
Really do appreciate you listening to this episode and checking it out. I hope you continue to do so with the next. I hope you have an appreciation for what I'm trying to do here, highlight all the different things all sorts of different creators are doing. I hope you get behind me on that and continue to join me on my journey. I'm Podcast Father, the indie podcaster. See you next time.